Okay, so we're going to continue our lesson with emotional development. And let me put up the slideshow. So when we talk about emotions, it's helpful to define our terms. So what do I mean by emotions? So emotions in general are a rapid appraisal of the relative personal significance of a situation, which prepares you for a given action. For example, happiness is going to result in you actively approaching a situation. Sadness is going to have you withdraw from a situation, but the withdrawal is more on a passive, slow way. Whereas fear activates the sympathetic nervous system, which is going to activate the fight or flight response. And then all of a sudden, you're going to actively withdraw from the situation fairly immediately. And then anger is a complicated emotion. Sometimes it can be destructive in nature, but sometimes anger can be a motivating force to help us overcome our obstacles. So one way of looking at emotions is a functionalist approach to emotions. And uh, taking this perspective in mind, the broad function of emotion is to energize behavior at attaining one's personal goals. Now, when we talk about this, events are personal relevant in many different ways. So you could already have a goal in mind, and the emotion is linked to the goal you already have. You could have others' behaviors altering the relative significance of a situation for you and eliciting an emotion, or a sensation itself could evoke positive and negative emotions. Ultimately, emotions come from ongoing exchanges between the person and their environment. Now, there's another way of looking at emotions and the relationship between emotions and cognition. You recall cognition is thought processes, and there are different kinds of thought processes. So one linkage between emotions and cognition is that emotion can lead to learning that's essential for survival. For example, if you see a toddler who's putting their hand next to the stove and you blurt out a highly charged no, they're going to get startled. It's going to elicit a fear response, but that fear response might be necessary for them to learn not to put their hand on fire. And it teaches them that to stay away from fire without them actually having to get burned. So they don't actually have to get burned to learn. Okay. And emotion and cognition are linked in other ways. So let's take the emotion of anxiety. Anxiety can be helpful at low and moderate levels, but when you have very high anxiety, it can be crippling. It could be incapacitating. It could affect your attention. It could affect your memory. It could affect your motivation to persist. And ultimately, people with high anxiety, they avoid the situation that triggers it. So if you're in an academic setting and you have really high levels of anxiety, it could interfere with learning and performance in the classroom. Emotions also affect memory. So the concept of a flashbulb memory is similar to a camera. The flash is released to brighten up an image. So similar to that, a flashbulb memory are memories that are brighter than the rest. And flashbulb memories come in many different ways. It could be an emotionally charged event that is positive, such as a person and their first kiss. A person might remember in great detail their first kiss, who it was, where they were, what they were wearing, things like that, or one's prom, most people, if you ask them, describe what you did or for your prom, people can remember at least the first half with great detail. Now that's a corny joke, assuming that they might have been drinking, but or giving birth, right? The birth of a child is very, very emotionally charged, but people remember with great detail. Or one's first marriage, right? Or one's first divorce, right? That divorce is another one of those where it's a negative event, but it's emotionally charged enough that you might remember it in great detail. Other negative events that are linked to flashbulb memory, the loss of a loved one. So a person, if they had a grandparent pass away and they were really close to that grandparent, they might be able to remember and recall and describe that event in great detail. On a large scale, things like September 11th, the terror attacks, it's been 19 years, but if you ask a person who was of an age of memory, where were you? What were you doing? How did you hear? People could describe the events of 9/11 very strongly. Or if you ask your parents or grandparents, maybe about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which is even further away, but they still can remember with great detail because it has a strong emotional connection. And I will argue, and I have no data to support this yet, but people are going to remember COVID-19. And 2020 is going to be a profound year for flashbulb memories just because it has affected us in so many different ways. People are going to remember how they handled it, what they did for the holidays, and so forth. Now, is it the cognition that affects the emotion, or is it the emotion that affects the cognition? Truth be told, it's bidirectional. Sometimes the emotion is affecting cognition, and sometimes the cognition is affecting emotion. Now, emotions affect social behavior too. So a child's emotional signals can affect behavior of others. For example, if you have an infant who smiles at you, it's going to draw you close to them to want to interact with them or play with them. Whereas an infant who cries, it's going to elicit you checking for pain or hunger or thirst or whether they're soiled. But either way, that child's smile or that child's cry is going to draw behavior out of people. Now, other people can influence a child's behavior too. For example, researchers found that if parents show a sad face or an unreactive pose, their children will look away or start to cry themselves, which is interesting, right? Because now we're shaping or eliciting emotions out of the child. And as we get older, emotions become very deliberate. For example, at first, caregivers initiate all positive emotional expressions out of infants. But by 9 months old, infants can draw or initiate emotional expressions from their parent. Now, we talked about the concept earlier in an earlier lesson about the concept of joint attention. And joint attention, we discussed in language. We discussed this in the context of cognitive development, but it also can play a role in emotions. So babies can follow their caregiver's line of regard. So this occurs both verbally and emotionally. And then when people don't know what to do or how they should react, there's also something called social referencing. And what that does is we look at other people's emotions and see how they react to a situation to determine how we're supposed to respond. An example of how this might affect us is laugh track. So if you have comedy television shows and the laugh track goes off, it makes you want to mirror that behavior and laugh. So these are just a few examples of how social referencing affects emotions. Now, emotions also affect health, right? So if you have emotional deprivation, it's possible to develop things like non-organic failure to thrive or psychosocial dwarfism, which you recall from earlier in the lecture. These are physical stature that is suppressed, such as height and weight, all due to some kind of emotional deprivation. So if a child cannot maintain their weight or they're not growing, it could be due to a non-biological factor such as emotional deprivation. Another important thing is stress. Stress on a long-term basis or chronic stress is linked to a whole host of conditions like cardiovascular disease, infectious disease, gastrointestinal diseases, stomach problems, and cancer. Now, so stress, we don't want to carry stress for long terms because it's going to affect our health. Now, fortunately, if parents are sensitive to the needs of their child, if there's effective caregiving, adults have the capacity to reduce stress reactivity in their children. So this is if I'm going to emphasize something, it's listen to your children, pay attention to their needs, and be attentive as much as possible to reduce their stress levels and reduce the risk of a whole host of things like heart disease, cancer, GI problems, and so forth. Now, emotions also have other purposes. So, for example, emotions contribute to self-awareness, in addition to emotions being influential in the physical, cognitive, and emotional domains that we talked about. For example, one concept called self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is our relative confidence in our ability to control events in our surroundings or develop some level of competency in a specific area. So by the middle of the second year of life, self-awareness is developed for a whole host of other emotions, where children will start to develop areas of competence, such as building Legos or singing or dancing. And self-efficacy, you'll notice that this is your relative confidence about a specific area versus the concept of self-esteem, which is a much more global sense of self-worth, where you feel I'm worthless, I'm a loser, or I'm amazing, whatever self-esteem you have. But self-efficacy is, no, I can do this, or if I practice hard enough, I'll get better at something. Another functionalist issue related to emotion is emotion self-regulation. Emotion self-regulation is the ability to control one's emotions. And at birth, emotion self-regulation is fairly poor. And as we get older, we get better at it. Kids and toddlers might throw tantrums in the supermarket because they don't get their way. But as we get older, we recognize that we don't get to express our emotions freely all the time. For example, as an adult, if you're working and your supervisor is very difficult and very critical, you might be hurt by that supervisor and you might want to curse them out or tell them off. But you will say to yourself, demonstrating emotional self-regulation, I can't do this. And the reason why I can't do this is because if I curse out my boss, I won't have a job. So that's controlling one's emotions. You may want to fantasize about it, but you may not actually do it because you recognize the consequence of not controlling your emotions. So now let's start to identify some of the basic emotions. And the basic emotions, if you look at the work of Paul Ekman, he talks about there are really 6 basic emotions, and he studied them in many cultures across the globe. And the basic emotions are happiness, fear, anger and sadness, disgust, interest, and surprise. And during the first half of the first year, children don't know how to express emotions fully effectively. So they're trying to learn how to coordinate their emotions in a meaningful way. But by about 6 months, you will see children's emotional expression is pretty well organized and specific. So that highlights the nativist perspective or the biological hardwiring for certain emotions, because those certain emotions, the basic emotions, are necessary for survival. So let's talk about some of these basic emotions. Let's start with happiness. When we talk about smiling, right? Parents get so excited when an infant smiles at them. But believe it or not, a baby's first smile is not actually a smile that they're happy to see you. It could be something as simple as gas. And the release of gas might make them smile, the sensation. So it could be during sleep. So the first 4 weeks or first month of life, babies smile most during REM sleep, right? Which is interesting because it has nothing to do with you directly. And then by about 1 month, infants start to smile at things that intrigue them, interesting sights, things that are eye-catching. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're expressing a smile for happiness. By 6 to 10 weeks, you start to see the social smile. And here we have some level of a smile that is interpretable. And a social smile is when the human face triggers that broad grin or that broad smile that we typically have. Laughter is another one. Laughter is related to happiness. So by 3 to 4 months old, you start to see infants expressing laughter, which shows a faster processing of information than a basic smile or a social smile. And by 6 months, infants are smiling and laughing more when interacting with familiar people, which is interesting because that particular preference to being and interacting with people that we're familiar with helps build attachment, that helps strengthen the parent-child bond. And then by 10 to 12 months, you'll start to see an array of smiles. So you might see the broad cheek raised smile to a parent's greeting, which we talked about. Or you might see a reserved smile when a friendly stranger approaches. Or if the child is engaging in some kind of play activity, you might have the mouth open smile. And within the second year of life, that smile becomes very deliberate as a social signal for others. Now let's shift gears to things like anger and sadness. A newborn will respond with anger and distress to any unpleasant stimulus. It could be hunger, it could be pain, it could be change in temperature, it could be change in lighting, It could be movement. Long story short, too much or too little stimulation will elicit distress and anger. By 4 to 6 months, anger expressions increase in frequency and intensity. And older infants start to demonstrate anger in a broader context or a wider range of situations. For example, if an interesting object or event is removed, their arms are restrained, or the child's caregiver leaves, or they're put down for a nap, they may express anger. Sadness can occur in response to things like pain or removal of an object or parental separation as well, but they tend to be less frequent than anger. Now, it's interesting because I'm wondering how many of you watched the movie Inside Out, which is a cartoon, but I think that cartoon was brilliantly made and is psychologically appropriate, right? So the characters are joy, anger, sadness, disgust, and I think fear. I don't remember all the characters. But the purpose was to start a larger conversation with children about emotions and teach children how emotions work in the brain. So if you remember that dashboard, that center, well, we have memory consolidation centers in the brain, and we have anger centers in the brain, and all of that plays a role. So now let's talk a little bit about fear. Fear is adaptive. Fear promotes survival. So one of the types of fear that you're going to see in infancy is something called stranger anxiety. Infants express fear to unfamiliar adults, and that stranger anxiety rises at the end of the first year and goes and peaks right around 18 to 24 months, right? So you see the danger cues around strangers, right? Now, it is true that not every child will respond the same to fear, right? So it depends on a child's temperament, their past experience with strangers, and the current situation. So all of these factors will play a role. Now, what's interesting is that in Western societies, who's responsible for taking care of an infant? More often than not, it's the parents. Whereas if you go to more collectivist societies, there's a saying, it takes a village to raise a child. That might be literal. So it's possible that in collectivistic societies that a child is tended to or cared for by many members of a society. Now, what does that do to things like stranger anxiety? The answer is it's going to reduce it, right? So if a child is used to being passed around or interacting with strangers, they're going to react to it with less intensity. So how can a stranger reduce the fear in an infant? First thing you do is be gradual in your approach. Don't approach rapidly. So approach slowly. Maybe you want to interact with a child holding a toy, or maybe you want to play a familiar game. All of these things are going to reduce the child's anxiety levels. Now, I talked to you about this a little bit, but parenting practices can also modify stranger and separation anxiety. So separation anxiety is somewhat different than stranger anxiety. Separation anxiety, by definition, is when a child is left with someone else and the caregiver is removed from the situation. If you have collectivistic caregiving, there's less anxiety than if you have individualistic or isolated communities. It's going to be more anxiety. Now, We also need to know the role of a secure base. The reason why there's anxiety is that a caregiver, a parent, oftentimes will serve as a secure base for the child. And that sends safety cues, that it's okay to explore, and it reduces the danger cues. But when that secure base is removed, it increases the risk of fear and anxiety. So when you have this challenge, right? So you encounter a stranger, you have two conflicting tendencies: fight or flight, or in the context of this lesson, to approach them or to avoid them. And as you get older, we start to understand the role of strangers and acquaintances, and that's going to reduce the separation anxiety levels. So we're able to discriminate between threatening and non-threatening people, so that separation anxiety decreases. By about 18 months to 2 years old, you start to develop higher order emotions as well. Things like self-conscious emotions, shame, embarrassment, guilt, envy, and pride. All of these require an awareness of oneself and how other people will view them. They also involve either an injury to the sense of self, or some kind of aggrandizement or enhancement of the sense of self. So you require feedback in order for you to understand self-conscious emotions. So these self-conscious emotions are activated by the responses of others. So for example, in Western culture, individual achievement is met with praise, which is going to elicit feelings of pride. Whereas in collectivistic cultures, individual achievement is met with embarrassment or a sense of shame or guilt. So it's interesting that the feedback we receive from others is going to shape the self-conscious emotions we have. So let's talk about shame and guilt. We alluded to that. Shame, in general, is associated with feelings of inadequacy. They're also linked at a later point with things like depression, aggression, and anger. Now, that is from a Western viewpoint, whereas in collectivistic society, feeling ashamed is not a bad thing because it promotes growth. So in collectivistic cultures, shame is a tool for growth. Guilt, on the other hand, is viewed or related with good judgment, insofar as it's not accompanied with shame in Western society. So it's flipped. Now, we talked a little bit about emotion self-regulation, right? Emotion self-regulation is our ability to adjust our own emotional state to a comfortable level so we can achieve our goals. The scenario I gave with one's employer or supervisor, your goal is to be able to feed your family. Your goal is to be able to pay your rent or your mortgage. So as an adult, you understand you can't just lash out, but it requires different abilities. So abilities such as focus, changing one's attention or shifting one's attention, inhibition, planning, and it requires a manual override of emotion. So it's a voluntary decision to control one's emotions. And it's interesting because as a clinical psychologist, we teach our clients how to regulate their emotions. We teach them how to manage their emotions to get the optimal results. And many times when people come into our offices, they're not very happy because whatever they're doing and how they're regulating their emotions isn't working. Now, with age or with being taught, one's ability to regulate their emotion will get better. And we'll talk about temperament later, but that also plays a role. So let's talk about self-regulation. In the early months of infancy, infants have very limited capacity to control their emotions. And who's responsible for controlling the emotions if the kid can't do it? The parents. So parents have a tremendous responsibility to soothe their children, to pick up their child, to hug their child, to rub their child's back. All of these things, if you show a sympathetic role, will comfort your child. Now, if you choose not to comfort your child, it may result in later problems in self-regulation or deficits in self-regulation when they're expected to control and regulate themselves. By 2 to 4 months, infants have the ability to engage in face-to-face play and shift their attention. Now, shifting one's attention is a great tool for regulating emotions. By a year old, they can actively move their body through space and either approach or retreat from a stimulus. And then by 2 years old, they have the capacity to shape the emotions of their caregiver, their parent, based on their internal state. So they went from the early months of being soothed and consoled on their own to, by 2 years old, shaping the emotions of another person. Now, by 3 to 4, language is further developed. So now they can verbalize what's going on. So one thing they could do is blunt out sensory input. You might see a young child put their hands over their ears and be like, la, 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 la. So they're not listening. Now, you might see that as an immature thing for an adult to do, but for a 3 to 4-year-old, that might be a tool they're using to self-regulate. Or you might hear children talking to themselves. And I know we talked about with Piaget and Vygotsky that when one talks to oneself, it could be understanding schema or practicing what we hear from other people. But now we're seeing that a 3-year-old or 4-year-old might talk to themselves for self-regulation purposes. Or an example might be, it's okay, it's not a big deal. And a final example from 3 to 4 is you might change one's goals. So changing one's goals could affect whether one expresses certain emotions. Another thing that another way that children learn to regulate their emotions is by watching parents. So if they have warm parents who use verbal language to comfort, they help their child cope with stress. Whereas if you have a dismissive parent, children might have more problems controlling their emotions because they want to be heard as well. So by the time they hit school age, which is 5 or 6, now they have even greater gains in self-regulation, but there are also new challenges because children start to compare their accomplishments relative to other children. So we talked about Erik Erikson and the concept of industry versus inferiority, right? So it's possible that if a child doesn't feel like they're succeeding in a classroom or someone is outperforming them, that they might have negative emotions that threatens their self-worth. And one of the challenges is to regulate that or channel that to improve their performance in the classroom. By 10 years old, so we're approaching middle school, here you have problem-centered and emotion-centered coping. We have other strategies. So if we can change the situation, then a problem-centered coping is like, well, what's the problem? What can I do differently about it? And making a choice to do it. And by that problem solving, it will reduce the emotional outbursts. Now, there are situations where a person recognizes that they have no control over the situation. It's not changeable. And when the situation is not changeable, there is a shift that must occur from problem centered coping to emotion centered coping, where they regulate and self soothe because the situation itself isn't changeable at the moment. Now, what you're starting to see, if you haven't caught it yet, is that emotional self efficacy is part of this. And by 10, they develop a sense of emotional self efficacy. They understand that they are the master of their emotions and they can control their emotions should they choose. Now, emotional display rules, how much or how little you show society about emotions depends on a lot of things, right? So society will determine what's appropriate and what's not appropriate to display. So if an adult is on an airplane and they're throwing a tantrum, that in society is viewed as far less acceptable than if you have a baby, right? It might be annoying to other passengers that the infant is crying, but they understand that an infant can cry. Now, what's interesting is that by the age of 3, children are masters at learning display rules. So they're able to put on what's called a social mask and show the emotions that society wants from them rather than their internal feelings. So they're putting on a social mask so as not to have to show their true feelings. So if a child is at a birthday party and it's not their birthday, and they become jealous at a gift that the person celebrating gets, they might smile even though they might experience internal states of jealousy. So that would be an emotional display rule or a social mask. Now, uh, culturally, it's interesting. There are differences in how different religions view emotional display. So, within the Hindu tradition, expressing one's emotions is viewed as more positive than with Buddhist tradition, where you're meant to be calm. So there was a study done in 1998 called the Angry or Okay study. And in this study, Hindus and Buddhists were exposed, to various emotionally charged stories where there was a lack of justice or unfairness, there was aggression. And then they were asked, well, how do you feel? Consistent with the cultural value system, these researchers found that Hindu children were more often able to express anger than Buddhist children. And it's because Buddhism stresses the need to be in a calm, serene, or peaceful state. Therefore, they demonstrated self-regulation and exhibited an emotional display rule that their culture valued. Now, we also talked about social referencing. Social referencing is the ability to understand what emotions are okay to express based on looking at other people. Now, by 8 to 10 months, children start to use social referencing for their own personal safety. Parents can capitalize on this and teach their children how to act in everyday life. But as they get older, they become more attuned to it. Now, let's talk about complex emotions like sympathy and empathy. Sympathy and empathy are not the same thing. So, sympathy is to feel sad for another person or feel sorrow for another person, whereas empathy is the ability to put yourself in another person's shoes, to truly appreciate the distress that they're having and experience the distress similar to the person who's going through the problem. So that's empathy, being able to feel the pain as if you were the person themselves. Now, empathy is acquired at about 2 to 3 years old. And empathy is a strong motivator of pro social behavior like helping and altruism or whatnot. So um, let's look at empathy, right? So newborns, they cry when they hear other babies cry, but I'm not sure that that's true empathy. They might be crying because, as I said, um, infants cry due to changes in temperature, sound, things like that. But by 2 years old, we do see children have the beginnings of empathy. And if they sense unhappiness in other people, they might try to comfort them or relieve that unhappiness. By early childhood, um, so this is 3 to 5 years old, where we see children have even greater understanding of emotions, and they're able to take multiple emotional cues into account. And by middle childhood, which is elementary school and adolescence, we start to see massive perspective taking that allows empathy, not just for what's the person struggling with at that moment, but their overall condition. So teenagers do a very good job at supporting each other for disappointment and getting into a college or things like that, even though it's perspective, even though it's on a theoretical basis. So by middle childhood and adolescence, perspective taking takes a whole new level. Now, there are individual differences in empathy, and temperament plays a strong role. So we see children who are sociable, assertive, and good at regulating their emotions tend to have greater empathy. But we also see from twin studies that empathy is moderately heritable. So there are differences. So there might be a genetic component to empathy as well. So that's the nature side of things, but not just temperament, but the environmental factors play a role too. So things like parenting. So if you have warm parenting, that's going to encourage empathy. Harsh, angry, and punitive parents, they're going to disrupt empathy. So on this slide, you're seeing the interplay between nature and nurture. Now, what is temperament? You may recall temperament is a biologically hardwired reactivity and self-regulation. So it's relatively stable. It appears early. So we believe that it's hardwired. Your relative reactivity. So that's how short or long your fuse is, and your self-regulation, how much you can control outbursts. So that's temperament. And Thomas and Chess did a study, and they demonstrated that there are many kids, they fall into different patterns. An easy child is referred to as an easy child because they easily and quickly establish new routines. They adjust to adversity relatively quickly. They tend to have an optimistic worldview to begin with. So that makes them able to adjust to change and disappointment relatively quickly. Whereas a difficult child tends to have a more negative worldview. They tend to resist change and they struggle with adapting. That's a difficult child. And then there's a slow to warm up child, which is a child that also has a positive outlook in general, but um, needs more time to adjust and adapt. And then there are some children that don't fit any of these molds. Now let's demonstrate how temperament could affect parenting. If you have an easy child, your parenting is going to be fairly flexible. So let's say you have a child and it's time for them to go to bed. And you say, Johnny, it's time to go to bed. And they say, okay, no problem. Well, you're not going to need to be overly punitive or harsh with that child because they adjust relatively smoothly. They adapt relatively smoothly. Whereas a difficult child, and I hate these labels because they label the person, not the demeanor. But nevertheless, a difficult child is called a difficult child because they're going to resist. So that same scenario, Johnny, it's time for bed. Well, Johnny may look you in the eye and say no. Now, as a parent, that's going to elicit some strong emotions out of you. And it might modify how you interact with that child. So you might raise your voice. You might use corporal punishment. There are so many different things you might do because the child is defying what is asked of them. Now, people say, well, what are we supposed to do if that happens? I say, pick the child up, put them in bed. And they say, well, what if they come back out? Because if it's a difficult child, they may come back out. No problem. We could play this game all night, pick you up, go back to bed. And if it was the television that was stopping them from going to bed, then there's no condition where you would allow them to continue watching that television. And you tell the child, listen, I'm going to do this as much, but you are going to bed, right? And you just keep putting them back. Now, a slow to warm up child, they need transitions. And an example of a group that is more commonly slow to warm up are people or children on the autism spectrum. They need more transitions, they need more adjustments. Now, if you have a child on the autism spectrum and it's time to go to bed at 7 o'clock, you might tell the child it's time to go to bed at around 6:45 and say, well, in 15 minutes, we're going to go to bed. So you're building the transition in so the child prepares themselves for going to bed. And they're going to listen more. Now, if you don't build a transition in, a slow to warm up child might behave very similar to a difficult child and tantrum. So I actually suggest that all parents should speak to their children as if they are slow to warm up and building transitions, because children like routine, children like structure. So preparing them reduces the likelihood of there being a tantrum. Now, in terms of temperament, Rothbard talks about different aspects of temperament. So there's fearful distress, which is wariness, and distress in response to new stimuli. Irritable distress is when one's frustrated, and positive affect is when one's happy. All of these are a subcomponents of emotion. So that's the emotional component of temperament. We also have a second component of temperament, according to Rothbard, that is attention. So how long you can focus or orient yourself to a task. And action, how well you are at physically doing, whether it be gross motor activity or whatnot, at achieving that task. These three elements, emotion, attention, and action, strongly impact temperament. Now, effortful control is a self-regulatory aspect of temperament where we suppress a dominant response, which we feel for a more adaptive response. So, how do we measure temperament? There are different ways to measure temperament, but one of the more common ways is parental report. Now, we learned earlier in the semester that one of the biggest challenges with parental report is that parents tend to have a overly positive view of their kids, so they might minimize um, negative behavior. Or in a case where the child is defiant, they might exaggerate to the opposite extreme. But parental reports are challenging because parents are not objective. So some researchers prefer to study temperament in a lab where you put a child in an unfamiliar setting and you measure how they deal with that. Or a psychophysiological approach would hook them up to machinery and measure the physiological responses from withdrawal of a novel stimuli or whatnot, or approach towards a novel stimuli. And you will see inhibited children withdraw, uninhibited children approach. Is temperament stable? Well, that was a debate we introduced earlier in the semester as well, whether whether we stay the same or whether we change. Well, temperament develops with age, and in infancy, stability of temperament is low to moderate. However, what's interesting is by 2 or 3 years old, your temperament becomes fairly stable. So long-term predictions around temperament and adult outcomes can start to occur from 2 to 3 years old, because that's when your response styles become more established. So how do genetics play a role in temperament? Well, we see that identical twins tend to be more similar in measures of temperament and personality. So about half of the differences in temperament and personality can be linked to genetics, which is not shocking, but that means the other half is linked to environmental factors, right? So heredity plays a role in negative emotions at a greater degree or to a greater extent than positive emotions. And we could see heredity much clearer after infancy, where there's a lot of natural variability. But there are environmental factors that play a role in temperament. So malnutrition or deprivation could result in maladaptive emotional reactions. What's interesting is if the child is put in that persistent malnourished state, it's possible that even after the diet improves, these children might be more fearful, distractible, and irritable than their age mates. And we talked about catch-up growth as a physical thing. But what's interesting is that persistent malnutrition on an emotional level may linger longer than physical growth. So that's important to note. And we see that if you cannot regulate your emotions, there's a lot of inattention and impulse control issues that emerge. This may manifest as ADHD. And how you raise your children will determine whether children maintain their temperament. So long story short, we have on this slide a lot of the environmental factors that drive temperament. And then we have cultural variations in temperament. So we talk about Western and non-Western societies, or individualistic versus collectivistic societies. So we tend to see that Chinese and Japanese babies are less active and irritable and vocal than North American Caucasian babies. And the reason is based on cultural norms. We also see that these babies tend to be more easily soothed than North Americans. So these are heavily based on parenting practices and cultural beliefs and practices. In general, there's a cultural value of being gentle and soothing and passive in Asian societies. Not that it's the ideal but it is an indoctrination. So we see more gestures among Asians. And the micro expressions among Asians need to be attended to a lot more than Americans, which are more active, stimulating, and verbal than their counterparts. So we also want to pay attention to non-shared environmental influences, right? So two people could be raised in the same culture, but something could happen between the birth of one sibling and another, which makes the environment notably different. So we talked earlier about 9/11. So people born before 2001 have a different mindset when going to the airport than people born after 2001 because of the terror attacks. I'm going to argue that children born before or after 2020 because of COVID are going to react differently. So if you have children on one side of it versus children on the other side, the children may know a different experience so that they can see the complexity. So that will change the similarity. Now, we also identify personality differences, which affects how we parent. I talked to you about the temperament and how a difficult child, in quotes, might elicit stronger parenting or more stern parenting than an easy child. And then obviously one's peer group and teachers and community also shape personality. All right, so temperament affects many things. So a child's temperament can predict their cognitive and social functioning. Things like attention span, right? So we can see how that predisposes a child for success or lack of success in learning, as well as cognitive development, right? So we see active children, right? They tend to have greater social networks than inhibited children. We tend to see those who have greater levels of effortful control tend to be more cooperative and willing to help than their counterparts. Now, the goodness of fit model, which was a model proposed by Thomas and Chess, describes how one's parenting practices and temperament come together in an adaptive way, right? So because let's take difficult children, for example. So difficult children tend to be at a greater risk for adjustment problems. So it's absolutely essential that you show supportive parenting or effective parenting. However, many times parents respond in anger and punishment, which actually interferes with the child's overall development. So it plays into the cycle of further difficulty with the child, which plays in the role of further anger and punishment from the parents. So it creates a cycle. So I'd like to continue. The next thing I want to talk to you about is attachment. So attachment is a strong emotional bond we have with a loved one and caregivers. So when we feel attached, we feel pleasure and comfort from them. When we don't have attachment, we feel isolated, alone, and fearful. So when we look at the development of attachment, there are different models. So from a psychoanalytic point of view, how do you develop attachment? It's based on feeding practices. And you might remember Freud, and he talked about the oral stage of development. Well, feeding is essential for developing a bond with a child according to this model. So if you don't engage in proper feeding practices, you might develop an oral fixation, or it might manifest as unhealthy attachments. If you like this model, look at people like Melanie Klein in object relations theory, they have a really good piece to this. Now, when it comes to attachment through the lens of behaviorism, they agree that feeding is an essential part of it, but it's really not about the bond, but it's about satisfying the need or reducing hunger, right? So from a drive reduction model, they learn to prefer caressing and smiling and all of these things. They link it to reduction of hunger. So let's talk about the three elements of attachment: body contact, familiarity, and responsive parenting. So when we talk about body contact, one of the key studies on this comes from Harry Harlow. And Harry Harlow bred monkeys under two different conditions. They were all of the monkeys were separated from their biological mother, and one was raised by an artificial mother that was wrapped in sort of like a chicken coop or coil wire. And at the top, it had a nipple to feed the child. And then on the other side, they had an artificial mother who was wrapped in a terry cloth. It was soft, but it did have a nipple feed. So in condition one, the child could be fed, but not provided comfort. In condition two, the child could be provided comfort, but could not be fed. And what Harry Harlow found was that the monkeys in general preferred the cloth mother over the coil mother. And that was shocking, because you would assume that if it was just about feeding, that the children would prefer the monkey that feeds them rather than the one that provides body contact. So what Harry Harlow suggested is that body contact and comfort provides just as much of a need as feeding. And that's profound. And here's a picture of the monkeys. Now, what happens if the monkeys don't get comfort? Monkeys that are raised in isolation and develop poor attachment tended to cower and fright. Many of them could not have children. They acted more aggressively. And the female monkeys that were artificially impregnated, they tended to be more neglectful to their young. So the stakes are fairly high here. A second aspect is familiarity. And familiarity is basically repeated exposure to someone or something could produce attachment. Now, Konrad Lorenz did a study on imprinting or bonding in ducklings. And what he found was that ducklings attached to the first thing that they saw after they hatched. Now, this should not be shocking, because many ducks, the mother hen or mother goose, pardon me, is sitting over the eggs. So that familiarity is the right familiarity. But in his study, what he did was he wanted to test this imprinting, and he had the ducklings hatch and see him first. And sure enough, the ducklings imprinted or attached to Konrad Lorenz. Now, he also found that there was a critical period. So what happens if the ducks hatch and there's nothing there? There's a window of time where this bond has to occur, or it will not occur. When it comes to attachment in humans, it's not so black or white. We talk about the concept of a sensitive period for attachment. So there's an optimal period to build these bonds or form these bonds, but they can occur at a later point with greater work or effort. And here's just a few pictures of Konrad Lorenz and his his ducklings. Notice when he's walking on land, they're following him. When he's swimming in the lake, they're swimming with him. And he was profiled in Life magazine for his work. And sure enough, familiarity plays a role. From an ethological point of view, we have Bowlby, who was influenced by Conrad Lorenz's work. And he said that this emotional bond or attachment evolves in a way that promotes survival, and it occurs in 4 phases. So the pre-attachment phase, which is birth to 6 months, there are natural built-in signals that bring babies close with others and vice versa. By 6 weeks to about 8 months, you have what's called attachment in the making. So infants start to respond differently to their caregivers and strangers. We talked about stranger anxiety already, and separation anxiety. All of this is linked to attachment in the making. And there's a sense of trust that is built with the caregiver and the child whenever there's a need that the child expresses. Then by 8 months roughly to 2 years, you have a clear-cut attachment. And now the attachment with the caregiver is clear. The kid is very clingy. They tend to demonstrate separation anxiety. So if the caregiver has to go to work and they drop the kid off at daycare, the kid is going to resist that. And by 2 years, roughly, the separation anxiety declines. And now you have a reciprocal relationship. What's interesting is I'm talking about from United States, but depending on the culture, that separation and stranger anxiety could go longer or be shorter based on, as I said, the parenting. Now, the third element of building attachment is responsive parenting. And Mary Ainsworth demonstrated, doing a study with the strange situation procedure, that parents could and should be used as a secure base. And if there's a parent that is responsive, when the parent comes back, they're going to be comforted. When a child leaves, when a parent leaves, the child's going to be mildly distressed. So the strange situation procedure was as follows. Mary Ainsworth placed a mother and a child in a room with toys, and a stranger entered the room, stayed far away, and then slowly came closer. Eventually, the mother leaves. Now the child is left with the stranger alone. Then the stranger leaves. The mother returns, tries to comfort the child. Then the mother leaves again. The stranger enters, tries to comfort the child, and then the mother returns and tries to comfort the child again. And this is a reversal design so that they can be clear on the effect of the mother leaving and the effect of the mother coming back. And what Mary Ainsworth found was that there are different attachment styles. And she said the vast majority of children develop what's called a secure attachment, where they're mildly distressed when mom leaves, but they run up to her and run into her arms when she returns. So what that shows you is they're bothered by her leaving mildly, but they're comforted by her returning, showing that mom is a secure base. She found that about 1/5 or 20% of the children developed an avoidant approach. And in this approach, they were not distressed at all when they were left alone. And then when the caregiver returned, they didn't go up to mom for comfort. So the best word to describe an avoidant attachment is apathy. They could care less about the coming or going of their mother. Then there was about 10 to 15% who developed a resistant attachment. Now, what's interesting about this is that the children are bothered by the caregiver leaving, mom leaving. But you notice in secure attachment, they were mildly distressed by mom leaving. In a resistant attachment, they're profoundly distressed by mom leaving. And then when mom comes, not only do they avoid contact from her, but if mom tries to approach, they're going to push her away. They resist her. And that might occur through pushing, kicking, biting, demonstrating they're upset with the caregiver. And then there was about 5 to 10% that behaved in a contradictory pattern, which he said was disorganized or disoriented. So attachment and stability is attachment. We talked about temperament and stability. Is attachment stable? Well, we tend to see in middle-class families, upper-class families, attachment tends to be relatively stable because middle-class families tend to have fewer number of stressors and a lot of support. So that attachment tends to stay the same. Whereas in lower income families, they tend to move from a secure attachment to many unstable attachment patterns. So there's far less stability in lower income households in terms of attachment. And that's because there are a greater number of stressors. There might be lower parental support and attention. There might be further parental mental health problems and so forth. So how do we build attachment? What are the factors that affect attachment? Well, the opportunity to build a bond, you have to seek that out and spend it. You have to have the quality of the caregiving. So the stronger, the more effective the caregiving, the better it is. The baby's characteristic or the temperament of the baby plays a role in the attachment. The family circumstances play a role, and then parental working. So let's go through all of them. So the opportunity for attachment. When we talk about building attachment, the window of time, the sensitive period is about from birth to about 6. That's when the best or most optimal time for attachment occurs. And we know this because there have been children who were institutionalized, and we saw that they cried a lot, they withdrew from their surroundings, they had difficulty sleeping, they had weight fluctuations. We talked about failure to thrive, situations like that. And if an institution had great child caregiver ratios, it's possible that even with the great child ratios, turnover was a problem. And you could have 50 caregivers by the time they're 4 or 4.5. So that creates a challenge for attachment, but we know that they still have a window of time till about 6. Sensitive caregiving or responsive caregiving is moderately linked to attachment. And it doesn't matter whether it's their biological or adoptive parent, right? And it doesn't matter about their income. So if you adopt a child, or if you're poor but you're responsive in your caregiving, that's going to help build a bond with that child. And what we find about caregiving is insecurely attached children tend to be far less engaged. They tend to be handled awkwardly. There's greater negative emotions like anger and resentment. We also see an interactional synchrony, which is an emotional dance between the caregiver and the infant, and how the caregiver responds to the infant in a balanced way. So this interactional synchrony is important. Being attentive is important. And then some of the child infant characteristics play a role. So attachment is not heritable, but that doesn't mean that it's not influenced by temperament, right? So what's interesting though is that there is an override. So let's take that child who had a difficult temperament. They still can develop a secure attachment, albeit harder, if the parent responds correctly to their needs. Now, in the time of Freud, there was a strong focus on mother-child attachments. And what we find is that children can develop multiple attachments, not just to mom, but they could develop an attachment to dad. And how they demonstrate their bond is different. Mothers oftentimes demonstrate their attachment through physical care, expressing affection, whereas fathers tend to be more playful in their interactions. So that's the lesson. And I'm going to stop there and stop the lesson, and we'll continue next week. Take care.